There are some places where people are born. There are places where people are healed. And there are places where people die. A hospital is all three. For the people who work there, death isn't something that happens once in a while. It's part of the environment. Nurses learn to recognize the signs. They learn when a patient's condition is changing. They learn how to keep working even when the person in the bed beside them is taking their final breath. But according to veteran emergency room nurse supervisor Sandra Kenna, there was one particular hospital where she encountered something she came to believe wasn't simply connected to death. She believed it was waiting for it. Sandra worked at a community hospital in New York's Hudson Valley. She says she had always believed in the paranormal, but despite that belief, she wasn't someone who was easily frightened by the idea of spirits. In fact, she says there was really only one hospital where she experienced something that truly scared her. And believe it or not, it happened on Halloween night. Sandra was sitting at the nurse's station. It was a normal shift. The sounds of the hospital were all around her. The equipment, the beeping monitors, the quiet activity of a medical floor. Then she saw the call bell light up. A patient was calling for assistance. Sandra got up from the nurse's station and started walking down the hallway toward the patient's room. And that's when she saw her. A woman was standing in the hallway. At first, there was nothing especially frightening about her. She looked like a nurse. But Sandra immediately noticed that something wasn't right. The woman was dressed in an old-fashioned white nursing uniform, not the kind of uniform Sandra or her co-workers wore, not the modern hospital clothing she was accustomed to seeing. It was an older style, white, distinctive, and Sandra knew immediately that the woman wasn't one of her co-workers. But the woman wasn't simply standing there. She began moving down the hallway toward the patient's room, and Sandra watched her. When the woman entered the room, Sandra followed. She walked through the doorway expecting to find the mysterious nurse standing beside the patient. But there was nobody there. The woman was gone. Sandra couldn't see her anywhere in the room, and the hallway outside was empty. And for a moment, Sandra was left trying to understand what she had just witnessed. She had seen a woman. She had watched that woman walk down the hallway. She had watched her enter a patient's room, and seconds later, there was no one there. But then she discovered something that made the encounter far more frightening. The patient in that room had died. Sandra says that realization terrified her. She had watched a figure dressed as an old-fashioned nurse enter the room of a patient who had just passed away. And then came another sound, a whisper. Sandra heard what sounded like the voice of a very old, frail woman, but she couldn't make out the words. There was no clear sentence. There was no message, just whispering. Sandra says she was the only person who ever heard those whispers as far as she knew, and that made the experience even more unnerving, because now she wasn't simply looking at something she couldn't explain, she was hearing something as well. Sandra says she initially wondered whether the figure could have been a stranger who had somehow gotten into the hospital, someone who shouldn't have been there, someone who had no reason to be wandering the medical floor. Sandra says that seeing it caused her a great deal of anxiety, because the figure hadn't simply appeared once. She saw the woman again, and again. Over the course of the next several months, Sandra says she began noticing a disturbing pattern. Whenever she saw the white uniformed nurse enter one of the patient's rooms, the patient would die a few minutes later. It happened repeatedly. Sandra began to recognize the pattern, and eventually she gave the figure a name. She called her the Angel of Death. She began wondering who this woman might have been. Perhaps she had once been a nurse herself. Maybe she had spent her life caring for patients who were nearing the end of theirs. Maybe she had worked in hospice or palliative care. And maybe in Sandra's mind, whatever calling that nurse had in life had somehow continued after death. And now, according to Sandra's interpretation of what she was seeing, she was still doing it. She was simply walking the same hallway, entering the same rooms, and accompanying patients as they reached the end of life. Imagine waking up in a hospital in the middle of the night. You're sick, you're exhausted, barely awake. The lights are low, the ward is quiet, and the only thing you really want is to go back to sleep. That is what Yvette Sanchez says happened to her. Yvette lives in Mexico City. She was hospitalized at Clinica 27 of the Mexican Social Security system because of complications from chronic appendicitis. She expected to be in the hospital for a short time. Instead, complications kept her there for about 8 days. During those long nights, Yvette became familiar with the routine. Nurses would come through the ward in the early morning hours, checking patients' vital signs and delivering medications. And one night, while Yvette was drifting in and out of sleep, she heard someone approaching. She could barely open her eyes because she was extremely drowsy, but she could hear the woman speaking. The nurse said she was going to check the vital signs, and Yvette remembers something immediately striking her about this woman. She was exceptionally kind. Her voice was calm. She was beautifully dressed and extremely well groomed. Yvette remembers thinking that she had never seen a nurse so beautiful. The woman went first to an elderly patient nearby. Yvette had been in the hospital long enough to know this woman. She was around 75 or 80 years old and had been sick throughout Yvette's stay. She complained frequently, and Yvette had noticed that only one young man regularly came to visit her, usually in the mornings. The nurse examined the elderly woman. Then she came to Yvette. Yvette could barely keep her eyes open, but she could feel what was happening. Her vital signs were checked. She was given her medication. And then she noticed something else. The nurse's hands were cold, extremely cold. But there was nothing frightening about her. She was gentle. She was reassuring. And before leaving, she told Yvette, "Don't worry, you'll be discharged in a few days." Then the nurse walked away. Yvette closed her eyes and went back to sleep. Maybe 30 or 40 minutes passed. Then the nurses who were actually assigned to the floor came through the ward. Yvette casually told them that she had already received her medication, and that another nurse had come in and checked her vital signs. She had also visited the other patient and told her she would be discharged soon. The nurses stopped and looked at each other, and then one of them asked Yvette a question. What did she look like? Yvette described the woman, her face, clothing, appearance, and her demeanor. And when she finished, the nurses looked at each other again. Then one of them told her. It was La Planchada. Yvette already knew that name. La Planchada is one of Mexico's most famous hospital legends, the figure of a beautifully dressed nurse who is said to appear to sick patients. But hearing the name was one thing. Realizing that she had just spent several minutes alone with her was something else entirely. The nurses told Yvette that La Planchada was known for appearing to seriously ill patients, and according to the story they told her, she could either bring a patient relief or give them what they called a good death. Yvette says she was terrified. She had heard the legend before. She liked stories about the paranormal, but she had never imagined that she would become part of one. And then she thought about the elderly woman, the woman the mysterious nurse had visited before coming to Yvette. The following day, that woman died. Yvette survived. 2 days later, she was discharged from the hospital. But she never forgot that night, because the strangest thing about the encounter wasn't that Yvette saw a ghost. She didn't know she had seen anything unusual at the time. Yvette says that after hearing this, she didn't sleep that night, but lay there wondering whether she would be the next patient, whether the nurse would return, whether the promise that she would be discharged was actually a promise or a farewell. But the mysterious nurse never came back. Yvette went home, and La Planchada remained behind in the hospital, or at least that's where Yvette left her. There was a story that circulated among the nurses at Howard Memorial Hospital in Biloxi, Mississippi. They called them simply the girls. Howard Memorial had opened in 1963 overlooking Back Bay, eventually growing to a 200-bed hospital. By the time these stories were circulating among the staff, it was a busy, functioning medical facility, not an abandoned building or some forgotten institution. According to the stories passed among hospital employees, 2 little girls would sometimes appear inside the hospital. They were described as being only about 5 to 7 years old, small children. And what made their appearances especially disturbing was where they were reportedly seen, beside the beds of dying patients. The stories had been circulating among employees for years. Some believed the girls had once been patients at the hospital, while others believed they had died somewhere nearby. But whatever their history, there was one detail that appeared again and again. People said they could hear the children laughing. Not crying, not screaming, but laughing. For critical care nurse Katie Kaler Farrell, the story became real one night when she was working in the ICU. It was the middle of the night, long after visiting hours, and there was something important about that particular hallway. Children weren't allowed in the ICU. Farrell was working her shift when she suddenly heard it, the unmistakable sound of young children giggling. She knew immediately that something was wrong. There shouldn't have been children there. So she went looking. Farrell followed the sound through the ICU, trying to determine where it was coming from, but she couldn't find anyone. There were no children, no visitors, nothing. Eventually, she returned to the nurse's station. That's when the charge nurse told her about the girls. Farrell had never heard the story before. She had simply heard children laughing in the middle of the night in a place where children weren't supposed to be. Now she had a name for what she'd heard. And it was the girls. But that wasn't the last time Farrell heard them. On another night, she was sitting at the nurse's station with another nurse. The hospital was quiet, and they were working in that strange suspended atmosphere that comes with a late-night ICU shift. Then they heard it again. Children laughing. Both nurses looked at each other. Neither one said anything. They didn't have to. The expression on the other nurse's face told Farrell that she had heard the exact same thing. And before either of them could speak, something appeared at the end of the hallway. A small red rubber ball. It was only about 2 inches across, and it came bouncing toward them. The nurses watched it approach, and there was something particularly disturbing about the layout of the hallway. The nurses' station was about 20 feet from a set of double doors, and according to Farrell, there were no other openings between the station and those doors. No doorway where a child could suddenly appear. Yet the little red ball had come bouncing toward them. Farrell had spent years working in intensive care units and emergency rooms. She was accustomed to being around death. She was also accustomed to long night shifts and the strange atmosphere that can settle over a hospital when most of the building is asleep. But this was different. She already knew the story about the girls, and now she and the other nurse had both heard children laughing in an empty ICU and watch a child's toy come bouncing toward them down a hallway where no children were supposed to be. The stories about the girls went beyond Farrell's experience. Hospital employees had reportedly seen them beside patients who were dying. Some of them actually complained about the children making noise in their rooms. Nurses reported hearing elevator doors opening and closing during the night when nobody appeared to be using them. There were also stories of the girls being mischievous, small disturbances that seemed almost playful. But there was another side to the story. The girls weren't always frightening. One nurse reported something strange happening when a critically ill infant needed to be rushed to intensive care. The elevator was needed immediately, and on more than one occasion the doors reportedly opened on their own, allowing the nurses to get the infant inside. Whatever the hospital employees believed the girls were, they didn't necessarily regard them as malicious. Still, there was a darker belief attached to them. There was even a belief that people who saw the girls would soon die themselves. Farrell never saw them. She never looked down the hallway and found two little children standing there. She never watched them walk past. She never saw their faces. What she experienced was something different. She heard them. But for the nurses who worked at Biloxi Regional, the story didn't need much embellishment. They already had a name for them. They knew where they were supposed to appear. They knew who they were supposed to visit. And they knew what it meant when the laughter started. The girls. Two children somewhere inside the hospital, laughing in the middle of the night, and sometimes, apparently, still playing. In a hospital, seeing a stranger in a hallway isn't unusual. There are always people moving around. Patients, nurses, visitors, doctors. Someone you've never seen before can walk past you and barely register. And that's what makes Mary McClellan's experience so disturbing. It was 1975. Mary McClellan was working as a ward sister at the Western Infirmary in Glasgow. She was in a room preparing a piece of equipment. The room faced a well-lit corridor, and then she noticed someone standing near the doorway of the ward opposite. A man. He was tall, silver-haired, and wearing a blue dressing gown. He stood there quietly. Mary assumed he was a patient. Nothing about the moment initially struck her as impossible. She watched him for a moment, and then he disappeared. Just gone. Mary didn't immediately panic. She assumed the patient had returned to his room. So she went back to what she was doing. Then, almost immediately, another nurse came toward her, and this nurse was upset. She had seen the man too. Mary listened as the nurse described what she had just witnessed. The same figure, the same corridor, the same man. But then came the part Mary didn't know. The nurse recognized him. He wasn't simply a patient who had wandered away from his room. He was a patient who had died 2 days earlier. Mary had just seen a man standing in a hospital corridor who was no longer alive, and another nurse had seen him as well. Two people, the same figure, the same place, the same night. And neither woman had initially known who they were looking at. And that's what makes Mary's experience so unsettling. There was no warning. No apparition announced itself. No voice called her name. She didn't walk into a dark room expecting to encounter the dead. She was working. She looked into a hallway and there was a patient. Or at least that's what she thought until he vanished. Mary later recalled the encounter publicly, and her story was included in the Guardian's investigation of hospital hauntings. But there was something else about Mary's history that makes this particular encounter even stranger. It wasn't the first time she had seen something she couldn't explain in a hospital. Years earlier, when she was still a student nurse at Stobhill Hospital in Glasgow, Mary had been working in one of the smaller wards. She saw a woman in a white uniform slip into a side ward near the door. Mary assumed she was the night sister. There was only one patient in that ward. The woman entered, then a voice called out from inside. Mary hurried toward the patient, and when she reached the room, the woman she had followed was nowhere to be found. The patient was alone and unconscious. Mary believed that whoever or whatever had summoned her had brought her there because the patient needed help. Two separate hospital encounters, two different apparitions. And both times, Mary was the nurse simply doing her job. But it's the man in the blue dressing gown that remains the most haunting, because Mary never went looking for him. She saw what appeared to be an ordinary patient standing in an ordinary hospital hallway who simply vanished. Mary McClellan had spent her working life around patients. She knew what sick people looked like. She knew what hospital patients wore. She knew how people moved through those corridors. And yet on that night in 1975, she looked into a well-lit hallway and saw someone who should not have been there. For a moment, the dead and the living occupied the same corridor, until one of them was gone.